Did you know wireless charging already existed in the 1930s? And no one ever told you about it? No, this isn't science fiction or some internet conspiracy theory. We're talking about a real, functional system, documented at the time, that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. A technology that, if adopted, could have pushed electric vehicles decades ahead of where they are today. Just imagine the impact. Cars that didn't need cables, plugs, or charging stations. Picture a world where nearly 100 years ago you could simply park your car and watch it recharge automatically, like magic. Now imagine that all of it was shelved, ignored, forgotten, maybe even sabotaged. The question that keeps coming up is, why? Why did something so revolutionary never make it to the streets? Who stood to gain from this technology failing? And why has almost no one ever heard about it, even now? We tend to associate wireless charging with the modern era. We think of smartphones, induction chargers, and of course, Tesla's recent breakthroughs. But the truth is, this concept, this solution, was thought up and tested long before Tesla ever existed. Back in a time when most people still used corded phones, and television was an unaffordable luxury. And no, the mind behind this innovation wasn't Elon Musk. It wasn't a Silicon Valley startup either. It was a nearly anonymous inventor. No funding, no marketing, just an idea that had the power to completely shift the global automotive and energy industries. He introduced a way to transfer energy through the air, using principles that today we recognize as the foundation of electromagnetic induction charging. What he had wasn't a fantasy. It was a working system, and for that time, shockingly efficient. So then, why isn't anyone talking about it? Why isn't this story in tech history books? Why hasn't any documentary covered it? The answer might lie where it always does, behind closed doors. At that time, the oil industry was already dominant. Combustion engines were taking off, and any idea that posed a threat to that system? It had to be handled, controlled, buried. Make no mistake, this wasn't the first time innovation got buried to protect economic interests. But in this case, the silence is nearly absolute. Nothing in school textbooks, no mention in automotive museums, just fragments, obscure reports, archived patents, a handful of newspaper articles lost to time. But today, you're going to hear that story. Today, we'll reveal the details of this project, how it worked, who created it, and what led to it being erased from history. And more importantly, we'll explore what that says about the world we live in now. A world still facing the same infrastructure problems, the same energy dependence, and the same resistance to change as nearly a century ago. So, if you believe history is written by the winners, and that not everything buried is truly gone, this video is for you. Because wireless charging in the year 1930 did exist. And the only reason you've never heard of it is because someone didn't want you to. Now, buckle up. What comes next might just change the way you see the past, and maybe even the future. Stay with me until the end of this video because I'll break down the technical details of this forgotten invention and show you exactly why major companies made sure this revolutionary idea was never allowed to grow. What you're about to see isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a window into a universe of possibilities that was intentionally shut. A missing piece of the tech evolution. One that might reshape everything you think you know about innovation, progress, and the powerful interests pulling the strings behind the scenes. Have you ever stopped to wonder why electric car technology, despite all the modern advancements, still feels so limited? Why we still rely on heavy cables, bulky chargers, and complex infrastructure just to power our vehicles? Why, even here in the year 2025, we're still struggling to find a truly practical and efficient way to charge a car without needing wires? Well, the answer might lie in the past, more specifically in 1930, a time when the world was recovering from the First World War, battling the Great Depression, And still in the middle of all that, a bold inventor developed a wireless charging system capable of powering an electric vehicle while it was moving. No cables, no plugs, no physical connection. And this happened nearly 100 years before Tesla was even a concept. This video is going to show you not only that this technology existed, but exactly how it worked. You'll see diagrams, technical documents, and original patents outlining the details of the invention. You'll understand why some saw it as dangerous and a few saw it as revolutionary. And you'll discover how, even though it was completely viable, it vanished, leaving no trace in the history books. But the most shocking part isn't what happened back then. It's what's happening right now. Today, companies like Tesla, BMW, and Hyundai are already experimenting with wireless charging. They're building stations that use electromagnetic induction, automated sensors, and smart grids to deliver power without direct contact. But here's the thing. Those systems are still expensive, limited, and mostly stuck in prototype mode. Why? Why, after a whole century of technological progress, is wireless charging still not a part of our everyday lives? Is it because the tech just isn't ready? Or has it always been ready, and never allowed to move forward? This is where the story turns darker. As you'll soon see, wireless charging didn't disappear because it didn't work. It disappeared because it was inconvenient. For the wrong people. Because its existence posed a threat to the entire supply chain, distribution model, and economic structure, built around traditional charging, and more importantly, around fossil fuels. And there's something even more disturbing. The inventor behind this technology was silenced. His ideas weren't just ignored, they were actively blocked by lobbying groups, corporate interests, and legal barriers. His tests were discredited. His reports were buried. His patent, even though it was public, never received a single investment. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And once you recognize that pattern, you start to see how it repeats across different sectors, technologies, and moments in history. The forgotten story of wireless charging is just one example of a bigger truth. Technological progress doesn't always follow the logic of innovation. It often follows the logic of power, because whoever controls energy controls progress. By watching this video until the end, you're not just learning a forgotten piece of history. You're decoding a system that explains why so many brilliant innovations never reach the market, why visionary ideas get buried before they have a chance to bloom. And you'll also start to notice how that same system is still alive today. Right now, with the global race toward electric vehicles, the world is trying to reinvent something that already existed, but without acknowledging it, ignoring past mistakes, and worse, repeating them. That's why this video is more than just a curiosity. It's a warning. At the end, I'll reveal what happened to this technology, where it ended up, and what some companies are quietly doing to bring it back without ever admitting it already existed. You'll understand the technical challenges that were solved back then, and are still somehow considered obstacles today. And, most importantly, you'll see how this story could directly impact your future. The way you drive, the way you charge, the way you interact with your car. Because if wireless charging had been adopted in 1930, the world we live in today would look entirely different. So watch until the end, not just out of curiosity, but to understand how the past was manipulated, and how the present is still shaped by decisions made nearly a century ago. The real question is, are we ready to rediscover what was forgotten? Or will we keep clinging to versions of history that only serve a select few? Maybe that answer lies at the end of this video. It all began in the 1930s, when a nearly anonymous American inventor developed a system capable of transmitting wireless energy to power vehicles. The promise? Cars that would never need to be plugged in. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine. Picture a busy street in 1932. Big, noisy vintage cars rumble by. Men in hats and dark suits, women in long dresses holding parasols. A world far removed from the internet, satellites, or smartphones. And yet, in the middle of that scene, primitive by today's standards, one man was quietly unveiling something that defied the logic of his time: energy transmitted through the air. This man wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, he didn't have a big lab or major investors. His name barely shows up in public records. But what he had was an idea. And not just any idea, a vision of the future. A concept so ahead of its time that many thought he was insane. His name was Charles F. Kettering. Or at least that's the name found in some technical documents. In others, the name changes, suggesting pseudonyms, patents filed under shell companies, or intermediaries who didn't want to be identified. Some say he worked as an engineer for a small firm in rural Ohio. Others claim he was fired from a major automaker after pushing too hard for this so-called unreachable technology. But he didn't stop. According to reports pulled from newspapers of the time, Kettering performed a public demonstration. He built a short track inside an abandoned industrial warehouse. Installed a system of underground coils connected to an alternating current transmitter, then rolled a small modified electric car onto the track. And when the car passed over the coils, something incredible happened. The motor ran, without being plugged into anything. Back then, it sparked amazement in a few, and silence in many. There are blurred, grainy photos taken with rudimentary cameras of the time, showing the vehicle on the track. Wires running from the wall, a faint light glowing under the hood as the car passed through the energized zone. And most striking of all, the sound, or rather the lack of it. The car moved in silence. No growling engine, no smoke, no noise. It was the future. But society at the time wasn't ready. Or, more precisely, the interests of the time didn't want it to be. The year 1930 marked a global economic collapse. The American auto industry was undergoing a transformation. General Motors, Ford, and other manufacturers were cementing their gasoline-powered models. Gas stations were popping up everywhere. And more importantly, oil had already become the hidden engine of the global economy. And in that environment, a car that recharged itself as it moved? That didn't rely on gas, oil, filters, or constant maintenance. It was far too dangerous to be allowed to move forward. The technology was deemed too experimental. They claimed there was too much energy loss over distance, that it wasn't commercially viable, that no one would invest in building roads with embedded coils, that the system could interfere with radios, telegraphs, or magnetic compasses, that it posed health risks, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, all the ingredients a revolutionary idea needs to be buried. And that's exactly what happened. Kettering disappeared from public records in the following years. There's no clear mention of him after 1935. Some say he was hired by a weapons company. Others believe he moved to Europe. There are even rumors he sold his patent, for a laughable sum, to a company tied to the energy industry. The truth, no one really knows. But the trail remains. The patent exists. It's there, filed, archived, with detailed technical language describing the process of electromagnetic induction in vehicles. The diagrams reveal the same principles used today by companies working on modern wireless chargers. But with one key difference. He thought of it nearly 100 years ago. And that changes everything. Because when we look back with the knowledge we have today, we realize this story isn't about an eccentric inventor. It's about a system that had everything it needed to succeed, and was silenced. Not because it didn't work, but because it wasn't wanted. This story hits something deep. The feeling that we were robbed, that progress was delayed, that the world could have been different if this idea had been supported instead of resisted. And that's where the emotional connection happens. Because everyone, at some point, has had an idea ignored. Everyone has felt dismissed. Everyone has seen something brilliant get rejected, just because it was different, disruptive, or inconvenient. And witnessing that happen to a technology that could have transformed electric mobility before modern electronics even existed, forces us to ask, how many other innovations have been lost this way? The man who created this system wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing solutions. He envisioned a future of clean, silent, continuous mobility. And that dream, which now feels like a mission statement for major brands, already existed back then, in the hands of a lone man with a homemade project but a visionary mind. And maybe that's exactly why he was silenced, because revolutionary ideas, in the wrong hands, or rather, in the hands of someone who doesn't bow to the powers that be, are seen as threats, not solutions. Now imagine if this story had been told earlier. Imagine if children learned about Charles F. Kettering in school, alongside Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. Imagine if car companies had followed that path from the beginning. Where would we be now? That's the question we need to ask. That's the reflection this story brings. And that's why it needs to be told. But this idea never made it to the streets. Why? The system worked. The inventor held public demonstrations. He built prototypes. He filed patents. Newspapers at the time reported in awe. Vehicle-powered, without fuel, energy transmitted through the air. The technical reports were clear. It was possible. And yet, everything disappeared. There was no follow-up. No factory took it on. No company adopted it. The inventor's name vanished from the records. The patent, though public, gathered dust in the archives. No university wanted to study it. No major brand wanted to test it. Why? Who was afraid of this technology? To understand that, we have to look behind the curtain, back to the 1930s, a time when the world was still feeling the aftershocks of the Great Depression, when the American economy needed rebuilding, and when the automotive and energy industries were already key players in the power game. At that time, oil was more than a resource. It was a symbol of progress, wealth, and dominance. The biggest fortunes in the United States were tied to black gold. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, refineries, global oil giants, all heavily invested in gas stations, combustion engines, and fuel distribution. Now imagine what a technology like this could do to that ecosystem. Electric cars that didn't need fuel, that didn't need any refueling infrastructure, a direct threat to an empire built on the gas can. Do you really think that would go unnoticed? Publicly, the inventor was ignored. But behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. According to letters and local newspaper records, he was approached by interested companies, offering to buy his patent. When he refused, the threats began. First, legal pressure, then so-called unsolvable technical issues. Until the scientific community, aligned with industrial interests, began claiming the system was impractical. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same playbook used to bury countless other inventions over the last century, just like it happened with water-powered engines, with experimental biofuels, even with batteries that offered better range than those we use today. The logic is always the same. If innovation threatens the system, it's not treated as progress. It's treated as danger. And the case of wireless charging was no exception. As you dig deeper into the documents from that era, one thing becomes clear. The major automakers, especially Ford, GM, and Chrysler, were deeply entangled with the oil industry lobbies. They had already invested billions into mass-producing combustion engines, building standardized assembly lines, and partnering with gas station networks. Switching to a new energy system meant breaking that chain and starting the game over. And let's be honest, those at the top never want to start over. Wireless technology didn't just threaten oil, it challenged the entire business model of the automakers. Think about it. Without combustion engines, electric cars need less maintenance. No oil changes, no belts, no filters. That means less post-sale revenue and less dependency from consumers. A wireless induction charging system would eliminate the need for cables, outlets, replacement parts, or specialized maintenance. It was simply too big of a risk for the industry to lose control over its own product. And that's why, even though the idea worked, it was dismissed as fantasy. More than just suppressed, it was mocked. Newspapers stopped covering the project. Academics began calling it an eccentricity, and the few companies that showed interest were pressured by their own boards to back away. It's all there, documented in articles, in interviews lost to time, in letters exchanged between engineers and executives. Some of these are now in the public domain, but forgotten, ignored, buried deep within the red tape of technical archives. The worst part, the sabotage wasn't just silent. In some cases, it was active. Reports suggest that an electronics company, supposedly working to develop the technology in 1934, had its entire project shut down after a visit from external consultants. 3 engineers were fired that same week. The prototypes vanished, and the entire initiative was shelved, stamped, not economically viable. But it was viable, because in reality, economic viability doesn't mean possible to build. It means aligned with the interests of those in power, and in this case, it wasn't. This kind of conflict repeats itself throughout history. The pattern is familiar. A disruptive technology emerges, threatens the dominant system, gets sabotaged, directly or indirectly, is forgotten until the system is ready to profit from it. And here's the great irony. Today, nearly a century later, companies like Tesla, BMW, and Toyota are developing their own wireless charging systems. They're pouring millions into labs, prototypes, and marketing, calling it the future of mobility. But this future was already imagined, built, and tested in 1930. And it was buried. Not because of a lack of technology, but because of a fear of losing control. That's the real conflict. The invisible battle between innovation and interest, between collective progress and concentrated profit, between an idea that could benefit millions and the decision to protect a few. And this is where you, the viewer, become part of the story. Because understanding what happened in the past is the only way to recognize when it's happening again. Wireless charging is just one example, but what it represents is much bigger. Proof that the best ideas don't always win, only the most convenient ones. Do you feel angry? You should, because this story isn't just about a car. It's about choices, about the price we pay for decisions made behind closed doors, and about how, if we don't question these narratives, we'll keep repeating cycles where the new is only allowed once it's no longer a threat. What happened to this technology is a painful reminder of that. It worked, it existed, but it was smothered by a web of interest determined to protect the status quo, even if it meant holding back decades of progress for humanity. The most absurd part? Documents show this technology may have been even more efficient than today's wired chargers. In fact, Elon Musk himself has acknowledged the limitations of current induction charging systems. Yes, you heard that right. Back in 1930, when radio was still a novelty and airplanes barely crossed continents, a wireless charging system had already been tested, with energy efficiency comparable to, and in some cases greater than, the wired chargers used today in next-gen electric vehicles. But how is that possible? The twist begins when we revisit the archived technical documents of the system designed by Charles F. Kettering. And here's the shock. He used principles of electromagnetic induction with such refined precision for the time that it still amazes modern engineers. Among the recovered files is a hand-drawn technical diagram showing how a magnetic field was generated by coils embedded in the ground. and how a receiver installed in the vehicle was tuned to pick up that field and convert it into electric current. The most impressive part: according to calculations from the era, Kettering's system achieved an estimated 87% energy transfer efficiency, a number that, today, is only matched by ultra-expensive modern systems found in BMW and Y-tricity prototypes. Today, companies like Tesla still rely primarily on wired charging, with wireless options limited to test environments. Even Elon Musk himself said in a 2018 interview that modern wireless systems still lose a lot of energy in the transfer process, and aren't the best solution right now for large-scale commercial use. Now imagine this: an inventor, working with analog tools, no computers, no 3D modeling, no access to advanced materials, building a more stable and efficient system than some of the high-budget projects being funded today with billions in investment. What does that tell us? It shows us that the problem was never technical. It was strategic. And, more than that, the project wasn't just functional, it was adaptable. The reports describe how the charging system could be implemented in garages, public parking lots, and even sections of roads, creating zones for continuous charging during travel. In 1932, that idea seemed impossible. But today, it's exactly what companies like Electrion are proposing: smart roads capable of charging moving vehicles. In other words, the concept of dynamic charging was already part of the 1930 design, and it wasn't just a futuristic dream. It was technically achievable with the resources of that time. That's the twist that changes everything, because it forces us to realize that what we now call innovation is, in many cases, simply the rediscovery of something that was ignored or deliberately buried decades ago. And this isn't just a quirky, historical fact. It's evidence of a deliberate distortion of our technological timeline. Patent documents from 1933 and 1934, filed under codes related to wireless energy transfer for automotive transportation, were registered under small engineering companies, all of which, interestingly, ceased to exist by 1940. Some of those patents were reactivated in the 1970s, but never pursued. Others were quietly purchased by holding companies tied to fossil fuel industrial groups. And here comes the most shocking point: the technical descriptions in those 1930s patents are strikingly similar to today's modern wireless charging patents. The only difference? Now they're wrapped in industrial secrecy clauses, protected by legal teams, and turned into high-cost products aimed at an elite niche of the market. Meanwhile, the general public remains dependent on cables, public stations, long wait times, and infrastructure that has barely evolved in the past 2 decades. This contrast exposes the true conflict. It's not that we didn't know how to solve the problem. It's that there was no interest in solving it. And the most ironic part? Today, governments and corporations give speeches about sustainability, energy transition, and innovation. They present solutions as if they were freshly invented. They sell the idea that induction charging is revolutionary. But they don't tell you that this revolution was already imagined nearly 100 years ago, and shelved. And when you connect the dots, the pattern becomes clear. Everything being done today, with advanced technology, artificial intelligence, sensors, and connected networks, had already been functionally imagined by a man working almost entirely alone, without any of today's modern tools. And yet, he achieved levels of performance that are still considered experimental by modern standards. So, the question is, why isn't anyone talking about this? Why, at the Consumer Electronics Show, during Tesla conferences, or in reports from Forbes and Bloomberg about electric mobility, does no one mention that the core technology was already known and abandoned nearly a century ago? Because to admit that is to acknowledge a serious historical failure. It means admitting that instead of progressing forward, the industry chose to hold innovation back for convenience. It means recognizing that we lost decades of possible breakthroughs. just to protect outdated business models and profit margins. And that's the real twist. The forgotten technology wasn't inferior. In many ways, it was better. And it wasn't left behind because it was flawed. It was left behind because it was too threatening to the system in place. This twist isn't just technical. It's ideological. It's historical. It's moral. Because now we know there was a path, a cleaner, more efficient, more equitable path. And it was cut off. Not by accident, but by choice. And that changes everything. Today, despite all of Tesla's innovation and the growth of electric mobility, we still face the same problems. Slow charging times, weak infrastructure, dependence on wires. Now imagine where we'd be if this technology had been taken seriously 90 years ago. At this point, the question isn't technical. It's historical. It's philosophical. It's even, in many ways, political. Are we just reinventing the wheel? In 2025, with self-driving cars being tested, algorithms managing energy flow in real time, and billions being poured into sustainability, we still face one basic limitation. Electric vehicle charging remains tied to cables, fixed stations, and waiting times. Everyday users, even with the latest models, still report common frustrations. Overcrowded charging stations, long waits, lack of charger standardization, and of course the fear of running out of battery in remote areas. Ironically, the same concerns raised in early electric vehicle tests from the 1910s. In other words, almost 100 years have passed, but the bottlenecks remain eerily familiar, and that's where the connection to the past becomes uncomfortable. Because the wireless charging system developed in the 1930s could have completely changed this reality. It could have allowed cars to charge while parked, while stopped at a red light, in energized zones along roads. No human intervention, no cables, no waiting. Today, that's marketed as something futuristic, but in truth, it's just a revival, almost a copy, of what was already proposed and tested nearly a century ago. Why does this matter now? Because it proves that progress isn't always a straight line, that often what we call innovation is really just a second chance, and that if we don't look back carefully, we risk repeating the same mistakes, not out of ignorance, but out of amnesia. And yes, the mistakes are being repeated. Today, electric mobility is celebrated as a symbol of modernity. But beneath the speeches, the industry still faces major structural issues. The dependence on lithium, the lack of infrastructure, slow charging, high production costs, and the environmental impact of batteries. It's ironic and tragic to realize that the same obstacles once used as excuses to dismiss the 1930 technology are still the very issues we face now. Back in the 30s, they said wireless charging was too expensive, too complex, too hard to scale. Today, industry executives say the same about dynamic road charging, that the technology needs more time, more testing, more regulation. But that leads us to an uncomfortable question. How much longer will we wait to use something that was ready almost 100 years ago? What we're really doing is trying to solve the same problems with the same mindsets. We're still stuck in a centralized, rigid, fragmented logic. We're still handing over control of our energy, infrastructure to the same corporations that once buried viable solutions for the sake of profit. And that matters a lot, because it affects the future of mobility. It affects the environment. It affects our autonomy as consumers. It affects the choices we will or won't have moving forward. If wireless charging technology had been developed back in the 1930s, electric vehicles might already be fully integrated into urban life today. Maybe there'd be no more lines at charging stations. Maybe powering up your car would be as simple as parking in the right spot. Even more, maybe the very design of cities would be different, cleaner, quieter, more efficient. This possibility forces us to reflect. What have we failed to achieve? Because someone, decades ago, decided it wasn't worth the investment? Are we repeating the mistakes of the past? It's hard not to think so. Today, we see promising technologies treated with the same indifference. Second-generation biofuels, fusion, energy, hydrogen engines, all with real potential, yet blocked by commercial interests or poorly designed policies. Meanwhile, major brands parade revolutionary solutions that are, in truth, just polished versions of what already existed. At global expos, we see wireless charging prototypes surrounded by bold slogans. The future of mobility. But no one mentions that the foundation for this technology was tested decades ago, and that if it hadn't been forgotten, it might already be standard. Today, that silence has a cost. And it's not just technological. It's human. It's social. Because delayed innovation also means delayed environmental progress. It means emissions that could have been avoided, traffic that could have been smarter, mobility that could have been fairer, more accessible, and decentralized. The truth is, technology alone doesn't change the world. What changes the world are the decisions we make based on what we already know, and what we choose to ignore. The story of forgotten wireless charging isn't just a curiosity, it's a mirror. And it forces us to look at the present through a different lens. It makes us ask, what are we burying today that might be rediscovered 100 years from now? What technologies are being blocked right now for being too inconvenient to those in control? And, more importantly, are we ready to break the cycle? Or will we keep celebrating as innovation what is actually just delayed progress in disguise? This connection to the past has a purpose. It teaches us that to truly move forward, we must recover what was forgotten, reconsider what was dismissed, give voice to what was silenced. Because sometimes the future is hiding in the past we chose not to hear. And what if I told you this wasn't the only forgotten invention? Yes, the wireless charging technology from 1930 was just one of many revolutionary ideas that appeared far ahead of their time, and then mysteriously vanished. But there's another story that few people know. A technology that, had it been embraced, might have completely redefined what we think of as electric vehicle range. In 1949, a group of independent engineers unveiled an experimental electric car that could travel over 500 kilometers on a single charge. That's right, more than half a century ago, long before lithium-ion batteries even existed in commercial form, there was already a project with better range than most modern electric cars. What happened to that project? Why did it never reach the streets? Who were those engineers? And why did their patents mysteriously vanish from public databases in the early 1950s? These are the questions we'll answer in the next video on the channel. You'll discover the story of the high-range electric vehicle that disappeared as quickly as it appeared, and you'll understand why, despite its proven efficiency, no car manufacturer ever adopted it. And don't assume it was just coincidence. Because the deeper you dive into these stories, the more clearly you see the pattern. Technologies that could democratize mobility, lower costs, reduce emissions, and lessen our dependence on fossil fuels are often buried, for reasons that have nothing to do with technical performance and everything to do with control. If the wireless charging tech from 1930 surprised you, just wait until you hear what happened to the long-range battery developed in 1949. The data is even more disturbing, and the connections to today are more direct than you might think. So don't go just yet. Click the video next to this one, or tap the link above, and uncover another story they never told you. Because while some want you to forget the past, we're here to make sure you remember. This is just the first layer. The real map of forgotten innovations is only beginning to be revealed, and you're part of this investigation. See you in the next episode.